The reason that we love abandoned places is that they give us a glimpse of the past. They may be silent now, but once upon a time, they were full of life and people. The world might have moved on, and so have the people who lived in these locations or used these things. And yet the things themselves have been left behind as monuments to the way things used to be. You're about to see some absolutely incredible abandoned objects and locations in this video. When the producers behind the movie Star Wars: The Last Jedi went looking for a location that would convey feelings of wonder and isolation at the same time, they didn't have to look any further than the Skellig Islands in Kerry, Ireland. Even some of the people living on the Irish mainland don't know about the existence of these islands and their spectacular ancient Skellig Michael Monastery. But they've been seen by millions on the big screen as the hiding place of the legendary Luke Skywalker. The monastery itself has been standing since the 7th century, right at the top of a rocky mountain 700 feet above sea level. Even back when it was used, it was a place for solitude and quiet contemplation. The monks here lived in humble stone huts, tending to their vegetable gardens and minding their own business, until the Vikings came and ruined their peace during the 9th century. Full abandonment occurred during the 12th century, meaning these buildings have been standing alone for almost 1,000 years. While many people know and love Cyprus as a tourist destination, those who study history or live a little closer to the island know that it's seen more than its fair share of civil unrest during the past century. It's mostly due to the civil unrest and conflict that Varosha Beach Resort hasn't welcomed a single guest since 1970. Until 1974, the beach resort in Famagusta wasn't only popular with regular families and their children. It also routinely hosted celebrities, movie stars, and high-profile names from the world of sport. After many years of success and easy living, the end of Varosha came very suddenly in 1974 when Turkish soldiers stormed into the resort. Much to Cyprus's dismay, they've never given it back. Turkey still lays claim to Famagusta, but the Varosha resort itself is fenced off, and the public isn't allowed access to it. That enforced isolation has turned it into a time capsule, with cars from the 1960s and 1970s still parked in garages, and holiday accommodations still full of clothes and personal items. By this point, we can probably assume that nobody will ever be allowed to come back for them. We usually associate crumbling castles with Europe, but Americans don't have to travel any further than New York if they want to see one with their own eyes. Bannermans Castle in Beacon fits the bill perfectly, and you only have to look at the lettering on the castle's walls if you want to know its former purpose. The castle, not far from the Hudson River, was once a place of safekeeping for a whole arsenal of military provisions and weaponry. There's a reason it looks so European in design, though. It was built in the year 1900 in the classic Scottish style by military surplus salesman Francis Bannerman, who is himself from Dundee in Scotland. The majority of the space inside the castle was given over to storage, although he also found room to include a summer home for himself and his family. A gunpowder explosion in 1920 damaged the castle badly, and then the loss of the ferry boat that connected the island of Polopol to the mainland in 1950 doomed the property to abandonment. After so many years of neglect, all of the internal floors have collapsed, but you can still take a guided tour of the property through the Bannerman Castle Trust. We promised you objects as well as places, so here's an up-close and personal look at the enormous Foxtrot-class submarine S-311 Al-Badr, currently standing in the dry dock at Kronstadt, Russia. These days, it belongs to the Libyan Navy, but it's actually a former Soviet sub, and used to go by the name B-533. At this point, it's doubtful that she'll ever sail anywhere again. She was launched in December 1976, and she's pretty old and rusty today. The official reason for her being in Kronstadt is for refurbishment and repair, but that was in 2005. 15 years have passed, and it doesn't look like a single day of repair work has been carried out on the creaking hulk in all of that time. It's thought that her situation was complicated by the unrest that occurred in Libya toward the end of Colonel Gaddafi's time in power, which was followed by sanctions against the country and its leader. The submarine couldn't be sent back, and so nobody bothered to start the work. At some point in the future, she's likely to be scrapped. Henry Ford is known to all of us as an automobile pioneer, but as a businessman, his interests extended far further than just cars. In fact, during the 1920s, he tried to set up an entire town in Brazil. Ford's motives were somewhat self-interested. He was concerned about the rising price of importing rubber for his car tires from European-owned colonies in Asia. So he set up his own rubber plant in Brazil and built a whole town around it. With typical modesty, he named the town Fordlandia. In some respects, he treated the workers he paid to live there well. The wages were good, and he built them homes, schools, and hospitals. In other respects, he tried to rule it from afar like a tyrant, and imposed a strict regime of enforced vegetarianism on the residents. Ford himself didn't eat meat, and so the people in his town weren't allowed to eat meat either. He also banned alcohol and regimented every hour of every day of the workers' lives. Unsurprisingly, they began to rebel just 2 years after the town opened for business in 1928. And by the late 1930s, it was almost totally abandoned. The skeletons of the buildings are still there today. We've already looked at the Skellig Islands, and you might believe that if you've seen one abandoned island, you've seen them all. But we'd like to challenge that idea by showing you Herta Island Ghost Town, which you'll find in the Scottish Outer Hebrides. The last of the people who lived here were evacuated in 1930, but the collapsing ruins of their houses are still there waiting for them to come back. When the last occupant moved out, it was the end of an era of human settlement on the island that lasted for 2,000 years. They didn't leave because they hated the island. They left because it was no longer practical to live there. The island is 40 miles away from any other settlement across the sea, and its traditional industries of weaving, fishing, and sheep farming were all under threat by the 20th century. To add to the problem, the isolated community still spoke only Gaelic, whereas the rest of Scotland had long since started speaking English. The writing was on the wall after the First World War, during which the lives of many of the young men who lived on the island were lost. And by 1930, the population was down to just 36 people. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. When Japan's Mitsubishi Corporation located an enormous coal deposit off the coast of Nagasaki during the early 20th century, they came up with an unusual idea about how to access and mine it. They built an enormous artificial island right on top of it and called it Gunkanjima Island. To the rest of the world, though, it's always been better known as Battleship Island because of its distinctive appearance, which resembles a mighty sea vessel. Shamefully, they also employed slave labor on the island, forcing scores of Korean immigrants to work and live there. Over time, conditions improved, with the addition of hospitals, schools, and restaurants on the floating town. But the business of Battleship Island came to a sudden halt during the 1950s when the coal seam abruptly ran out. With no other reason for anyone to stay there, Battleship Island's population dropped from 6,000 to 0 within the space of a few weeks. Japan then sealed off the island and refused anyone permission to visit until 2009. The first few visitors who went back to Gunkanjima that year said it was like going back in time, with the workers' homes so perfectly preserved that open newspapers were still on the kitchen tables. An abandoned island is already a pretty creepy concept. When you fill that island with old dolls, it gets a whole lot creepier. That's why you'd need nerves of steel to visit La Isla de las Muñecas in Mexico City, Mexico. The name of the location literally translates as Island of the Dolls, and it lives up to that title. The dolls aren't cute or cuddly, though. Instead, they're ancient and rotting. Some of them have been hanged from trees, and others have been deliberately decapitated. Taken all together, it's like walking onto the set of a particularly gruesome horror movie. The island owes its existence to the work of an eccentric man named Don Julian Santana. During the 1960s, he left his wife and family and moved alone to a small island on Texulio Lake. It's said that Santana saw a girl drown in the lake and spent the rest of his life honoring her memory by covering his private island with dolls that he fished out of the canal or pulled out of the trash. Every visitor Don ever welcomed to the island found the dolls terrifying, but he saw them as protectors and considered them to be beautiful. In 2016, the Disney Company opened a Disneyland theme park in China. In doing so, they delivered an authentic version of something that the Chinese government had unsuccessfully attempted to replicate several years earlier. China didn't originally want to reach out to Disney, and instead tried to build its own fantasy theme park called Wonderland in the middle of Beijing. As grand as the plans were, and as beautiful as some of the buildings looked, the park didn't sell a single ticket. For reasons that have never been made clear, funding for the project was withdrawn a little over 15 years ago, with the park around 75% built. With the majority of the facades completed by that point, for several years Wonderland had the atmosphere and aura of a strange post-apocalyptic world. Those facades have long since come down, though. The farmers who were evicted to make way for the park have returned to the land and reclaimed it piece by piece. And a major demolition effort in 2013 knocked down almost everything apart from the park's castle. It's now a monument to days that never came. Trying and failing to emulate Disney isn't a uniquely Chinese pursuit. We've also seen it happen in Belgium, with Dottie Park in Moorsled. In truth, the location didn't start out as an attempt to ape the popularity of Disney. It started out as a children's refuge and expanded into a theme park with the addition of rides and attractions over time. When it opened in 1950, it didn't offer any more in terms of entertainment than a concrete playground. But by 1980, it had roller coasters, dodgems, climbing frames, and the longest monkey bridge in all of Europe. By the late 1980s, it was welcoming 1 million visitors each year. But those visitors were wearing the aging rides out fast, and no money was being spent on replacing them. That culminated in a terrible accident in the year 2000 on the Nautic Jet ride, which cost a young boy one of his arms. And when Dottie Park closed 2 years later for renovations, many local residents speculated that it would never reopen. They were right. The rides were eventually removed rather than replaced. And as of early 2020, there's very little of it left. For our next abandoned location, we're taking a trip to Georgia. No, not the American state. We're talking about the European country. In Georgia, you'll find something of an architectural curiosity in the shape of the Kakheti Pillar, a tiny church somewhat improbably located at the top of a tall column of rock. The natural rock has been a focus for spiritualism since long before Christianity. For visibly obvious reasons, pagans used the column as a focus of fertility rituals for hundreds of years, before the country adopted Christianity in the 4th century. The church came 3 centuries later. Although how people of the era managed to get all the necessary building material to the top of the column is a mystery. Even today, the only way up is a rickety and rusty iron ladder, which visitors are invited to use at their own risk. As the building technically still belongs to the Georgian Orthodox Church, women aren't allowed to visit. They're not missing out on much, though. The church is closed, and there isn't much to look at other than a memorial to someone who fell from the pillar several decades ago. The creation of the Eurotunnel, which is better known to our British viewers as the Channel Tunnel, was a cooperative French-British project that took decades to complete and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The tunnel connects the United Kingdom to the European mainland, and the trains that run down it allow passengers to travel from London to Paris in a little over 2 hours. Because of the complex nature of the tunnel and its track, the trains that run on it are highly specialized units. That's why it's a little surprising to see one covered on graffiti and falling to pieces in the French town of Valenciennes. This is Eurostar 373018, which ran down the tunnel between 1994 and 2016 before being retired in favor of a more modern train. Officially speaking, it's supposed to be in storage, but these pictures tell a different story. Perhaps things could have been worse, though. The majority of the 373 class trains have been scrapped. And so at least this one gets to enjoy a new life as a home for wild animals and birds. Still, it's remarkable to think that the Eurostar has decayed this badly after just 4 years of inactivity. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!